Good afternoon, D'Angelo.
Good afternoon.
I'm delighted to work with you again. So you serve as the project manager for the Sacramento Violence Intervention Program. Would you tell me about the work that you do and the populations, communities, and neighborhoods that you serve?
Sure thing. The Sacramento Violence Intervention Program is a program that works with young people ages 15 to 26 who've been shot, stabbed, or assaulted almost to death. Basically what we do is we follow them for about 6 months to a year and offer a variety of services to help them pretty much cope with their injury and recover.
Great. So how did the Sacramento Violence Intervention Program begin and why? What was the genesis of that?
Yeah, so Sacramento Violence Intervention Program started back in 2010. 2010 was a very violent year for Sacramento. We saw homicide rates that were tremendously high. Actually, for Sacramento, I think we were second in the state when it came to homicide rates for our area. And so there was a huge outcry for something to happen, some change to happen within the community, particularly the South Sacramento area. There was a large-scale incident that happened in a strip mall where two rival gangs were at a barber shop. Well, one gang was there getting their hair cut, and another gang came and ended up exchanging gunfire. In the midst of that, a young lady was actually killed, shielding her son as she was putting him into his car seat. And so community as well as city officials were up in arms. Something needed to be done in the community. Kaiser Permanente was building their trauma unit in the South Sacramento area, and also figured with the rise in violent injuries coming into the hospital that this type of program would be very helpful to the community. So we basically took a model that was effective and proven from a program called Caught in the Crossfire out of Oakland, California. Youth Alive is the organization, and we modeled the Sacramento Violence Intervention Program after that same program, and that's pretty much how we came into existence.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great historical perspective. So in talking about victims of violent crime, so there's the individuals that are affected, but you're also talking about other people that are affected by these crimes. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there, of course, there are those who are violently injured, and we see that some of those injuries have to do with gang affiliation and gang activity, but then there's also those who are being affected at schools, at parties, who are innocent bystanders just at their home. And so we're seeing the effects of violence happening to all ages and all people. I like to say that violence doesn't necessarily have a face, because bullets don't have names, and we see a large range of folks who are injured coming from pretty much all demographic.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have the bystander of the mom and her baby. I also wonder about the people that may have witnessed that violent crime. What is it like for them? Right.
So we often talk about trauma and how violence creates trauma in our patients, but what we see, we often don't talk about community trauma. And so there is a lot of, for instance, that barbershop shooting, there were store owners, there was parents, there was community members walking around, and they all witnessed it. And so there's a level of trauma that each of them have experienced from that. And our program really does work with communities as well to address traumatic events and basically help individuals cope. We particularly work with patients of violence, but what we found is whole families are traumatized, right? So I'm just thinking about simple things like if you get the phone call that your child has been shot, how traumatizing that is. And then the drive over to the hospital, how traumatizing that is. And then getting to the hospital, navigating that system, trying to find your child, how traumatizing that is. And those things continue after the patient is home and healing up, taking care of them, packing their wounds, making sure they don't get infections. All those things traumatize not only parents, but siblings and close friends and close relatives all around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard you say before that we have a lot of services after people have experiences
Yeah.
like heart attacks
Mm-hmm.
or for diabetes, but
Mm-hmm.
there has not historically been a whole lot of
Right.
services around victims of violent crimes.
Right.
I know I've heard you talk about adverse childhood events,
Mm-hmm.
ACEs.
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between ACEs and violence?
Yeah. So adverse childhood experiences, it was a study that was done in the late 70s by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. And basically what they found is they took adults and they measured the amount of trauma they experienced as children and linked that with chronic health disease like um, high cholesterol, asthma, heart attack, those types of things. And they saw that if a person experienced 4 or more ACEs, then their risk of these chronic diseases were higher at adulthood. And what we find is in the communities that I work with and for, violence happens often, and maybe not necessarily to individuals, but like we said, we're seeing those things happen in the community. And so those are traumatic events which could lead to health disparities when these individuals get older. Yeah.
I also heard you using the words historical trauma.
Hmm.
Would you talk about what historical trauma means and how it's related to how an individual may react in any given situation?
Yeah, yeah. So we look at young people and people in general, and we kind of uh, say, they're acting out or they're doing these things that we consider to be bad or indecent or unsavory, and we don't ask why. We don't ask why this is happening to you, what's going on with you. And when we start to find out, in the work that I do, it's very interesting. I get young people that come in with these violent injuries, being shot or stabbed or severely assaulted, and technically that's not their first injury, not necessarily saying that being shot previously, but they're injured from the trauma they experienced early in life, the things that they see. And so that's not their, the violent injury coming into the emergency room or the trauma bay isn't their initial brush with trauma, right? And so what we're starting to see is a pattern. We're seeing a pattern of historical trauma from this kid is shot. His dad was shot. His grandfather was shot. And so it's perpetual and it continues to move forward. And so what we try to do is teach around historical trauma, things that we've experienced growing up and looking back at our moms and our dads, and even going further. A lot of times we don't like to talk about the things that happen, and I can speak directly to the African American culture. We don't like to speak about things that have happened to us. We kind of sweep things under the rug. What happens in our house stays in our house. There's a lot of trauma that our community has experienced that we just don't talk about, right? I was telling some folks just the other day, I realized truthfully, when people say, "Why are you still talking about slavery?" And I'm just like, well, honestly, I'm only 4 generations removed from slavery.
Right.
I'm only 2 generations removed from Jim Crow. This stuff is still real and evident, not only in our communities, but in our households, what we're dealing with each other,
Right.
in our households. So historical trauma, generational trauma, that plays a big part it's a big, large piece of the puzzle on getting past and healing from these certain issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in talking about trauma.
Hmm.
I understand that your program is committed to trauma-informed care. So what does trauma-informed care look like?
Yeah.
And the second piece to that question is there a way that perhaps healthcare professionals can be part of maybe breaking this cycle that you were describing?
Yeah, yeah. Trauma-informed care looks like, really, like I said, not asking why are you doing this, but what happened to you. Starting with those principles, being more culturally competent, right? Dealing with Sacramento is a tremendously diverse city, and so we have lots of different ethnicities coming into our hospital rooms, into our community-based organizations, in our school systems. Sitting down, having a conversation on what culture is like, right? Being trauma informed basically gets you to start looking at previous situations. What happened before this original reason why you came into our emergency room, or why you're acting out in school? What's going on at home? Looking more so at what trauma does to the brain. That helps you begin to understand, okay, well, maybe it's not me that this person is lashing out at. Maybe something happened, and now brain functioning is a little different because of the trauma that they've experienced. And so trauma-informed practices look like healing and hope, and digging a little deeper past those initial, incidents that you can see with your eyes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's really easy for healthcare professionals to begin to blame and make assumptions about people's motivations and perhaps lifestyle choices. But trauma-informed care is really a tool for us to understand the history and the more complex issues around what led up to this event.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes.
So it sounds like, I mean, we've been talking about trauma in terms of a physical thing, but there's more to trauma than just the physical event
Oh yeah.
that happens. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. Trauma can come in any form. I mean, it's traumatic when homes are broken, right? When divorce happens, it's traumatic when you're walking into a school and you may be the only African American there, or in a public setting where you're the only something there, right? Bullying, those types of things don't necessarily come with violence or injury, but because they don't fit, and they're a constant, they begin to be traumatic. We know that things like natural disasters, those are traumatic. Those bring up things, fires, simple stuff. But trauma isn't just physical, but it's also a mental thing. And one of the things that we work with communities of color is the stigma behind mental health help and care. And so there's just a foul stigma around taking care of yourself when it comes to your mental health. And it's basically explained, you go to a doctor and you take care of, when you're hurting physically, when your mind is hurting, when you can't think right. It doesn't necessarily mean you're crazy to sit down and talk to someone about the things that you're thinking about. It's actual health. Right? And even in that, I was having a conversation around health, and just the stigma around just health. Getting a population to understand it's okay to go get checked out, right? You don't have to wait until your body is failing you. You don't have to wait till your mind is fleeing, right? It's this stigma, again, around that's even unspoken. I talk to the older folks in my community and in my home, and they say things like, "Oh no, I won't. I'm not going to the doctor. They're gonna give me the flu, or they're gonna give." But those things happened in our society, so there's a fear, right? There's a real dissonance with it when it comes to health care. And let alone mental health care, because that's one of those things that we definitely don't take advantage of as an African American community. But we're starting to change the thinking around that. We're starting to change the dynamic around just health care in a whole, and trauma not only affecting you physically but also mentally.
Yeah, and we're talking about historical trauma,
Hmm.
and why are we still talking about things like slavery? But some of the very real things that happened around slavery were experimentation,
Right.
and some very cruel things that have informed the way that we do healthcare now. And it's not been that long ago, so
Right.
it stands to reason that people would distrust the healthcare
Very
system
much
and
so.
wonder if we're really thinking about their best interest.
And to that, I think we really need to start having more conversations around those types of things. I
Yeah.
remember speaking to a class, and they had no idea that the Tuskegee Institute experiment happened to all of those African American men,
Yeah.
giving them syphilis and whatnot. Um, and there's just not a conversation about those things. We like to move forward quickly
Right.
without
Yeah.
having a conversation around healing, right?
Hmm.
I say that same thing about all those other aspects systematically, from
Right.
school districts to police departments to all those things. We all need to sit and heal, and
Hmm.
it's going to take time, but hopefully, work that we're doing continues to move forward and that happens.
And that brings up something else I wanted to talk with you about is the education system. Do you see a relationship between the way that our education system is set up and violence in communities?
Yeah, public school is difficult for populations of color when it comes to just oversized classes, lack of attention, things of those matters. Teachers are overworked and underpaid, and everyone's tired across the board. And so what you're seeing is kids that aren't interested in going to school, so they're truant, and so they're out doing
Hmm.
whatever, which leads to violence, right, or
Hmm.
crime. And school districts who are focused on meeting test scores and hitting bottom, line and bottom dollar type things, and kids get forgotten, right? And so it leads to violence. But again, I like to think that violence is simply a symptom of a larger issue, right?
Yeah.
Violence is simply a branch of a rooted problem,
Right.
right? And so when we see like a school system just as overpopulated as they can be, and no concern for um, I shouldn't say no concern, little concern
Hmm.
for the population they're serving, that's going to lead to these branches. That's going to lead to these different symptoms. But
Right.
there's a deeper rooted issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a conversation that we've had previously, you were talking about Sacramento having a particularly high homelessness rate.
Hmm.
How do you think that that impacts the violence rates in Sacramento?
Yeah, Sacramento does have a very high homeless rate and even higher statewide rate of young people who are homeless, right? And from experience, the work that I do here and through ministering, pastoring, I've seen young people who have been homeless. I actually had a young lady tell me about a story. They were homeless. There was some construction going on in a building across the way. The weekend was coming, and they knew that these construction workers weren't coming back until Monday. And so what they decided to do was, hey, there's a structure here. We can get in from out of the rain and sleep in this structure, right? So they broke into this structure, slept there, ended up getting caught and arrested, and now they have records,
Now they're in
right?
the legal
Now they're in the
system.
legal system.
Right.
So it just continues to snowball. You have no place for these young people who are homeless, or homeless in general. We're I guess, working on that issue or problem. But I see more and more young people who are trying to figure out ways to survive, right?
Right.
If they don't have a relationship with folks to couch surf, then they're sleeping by the banks of the river,
Yeah.
and they're youth, yeah, they're young people, and those are things that we definitely have to address. And we talk about adverse childhood experiences. Well, there you go,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's building a case for their health later on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Great. So, in the work that you do, Do you see a relationship between human connection or lack thereof and violence?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely see that. I don't want to sound like one of those old guys that say it was better in my time, and but I do see that there is a greater lack of personal communication when it comes to one-on-one, face-to-face conversations. Um, we live in a age where social media and technology is at a rise, and it's a great thing. Technology is great. We're moving forward, but it also takes away from that personal connection, that personal communication. And in the work that I do with these violent injured victims, I see most of the time that this, may have been, it may have not happened. This injury may have not happened if there was a 5-minute one-on-one conversation, right?
Right.
To have an individual who was shot and paralyzed over a misunderstanding. So a high schooler, this kid is now paralyzed for the rest of his life. And then you have the high schoolers who shot him who are locked up for the rest of their lives.
Right.
So we have two, areas of young people who are forever damaged and forever affected by what could have been resolved by a simple 5-minute conversation.
Yeah.
And so what we miss and what we lack is young people taking the time to look eye to eye and say, hey, listen, I saw you doing this. And then that other person saying, hey, no, wait, that's not what I was doing. I was actually doing this. Well, there you go. No need to pull out a knife. No need to pull out a gun. No need to physically fight. You actually communicated your way out of the situation. So I see that very often in the work that I do.
Yeah. And that ties into what you're saying about a focus on SAT scores and things like that. What if we had a focus on how to de-escalate
Exactly.
tough situations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of focus on de-escalation and trauma-informed care and those types of things when it comes to school, and as we mentioned the ACT example, I really realized, man, schools are so important to our young people's everyday life, not just to educate, but we should be pouring into them in other ways.
Right.
Seeing as personally with my kids, they're at school 8 to 10 hours a day.
Right.
I come home, I feed them, I talk to them. That's like 4 hours before they can go to bed.
Yeah.
Right? And then we get up and we repeat the cycle. And so schools are spending way more time with kids than their actual parents.
Right.
And so things like, conversations around de-escalation, things like conversations around trauma and addressing those things in a young person should be focused more in schools, at least I believe.
That seems like a good opportunity. So, in your opinion, or in your expert opinion, what do healthcare providers need to know when providing care to individuals or communities that have experienced violence?
Yeah, I think the first thing out of the gate is we have to remember that these are people, right? These are simply human beings with lives and families and situations just like them going on in their life, right? Sometimes we see, especially with those types of injuries, a gunshot victim come in or a stabbing victim come in, and we automatically say, what did you do? Well, what was that person doing to put themselves in that, situation? Or we say, this is typical of this race or this,
Right.
and so as a health professional, we have to start getting in the mindset of this is a person with a life outside of this injury. What can I do to support, right? And then that whole trauma-informed piece, just knowing, one, that this isn't the first time this person's been injured. What's going on in his background in life and things of that matter. So health professionals, they play a large role in building the community. Sometimes we feel like we don't in the health profession because we're caught, behind the four walls of our organization or hospital or whatnot, and we're not maybe touching the community, on foot and grassroots. But every opportunity you have, every person that comes into your ER or your doctor's office or, clinic or whatnot is an opportunity to touch community. And if you begin to look at it like that, then community begins to change. The perspective of healthcare and healthcare professionals begins to change in the eyes of the community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
Healthcare. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there's a way that the voices of healthcare providers can be leveraged to positively impact communities? I mean, I understand what you're saying about when somebody comes in and having this connection. I mean, it's back to that human connection thing of seeing people as individuals. In terms of changing systems, is there something that we can do as a collective group of healthcare professionals to make change and perhaps reduce the violence rates?
Yeah. In a professional role, we seem to have a larger voice than those who are, in the community or lay members, if you will, of a community. And so I think health professionals need to become more vocal about the things that they're seeing day in and day out in their hospitals or health systems, right?
Yeah.
Giving voice to that, being the voice for those that are voiceless, right? If you're seeing a disproportionate number of a certain race or ethnicity or population coming into your spaces for the same issues or the same sicknesses and illnesses, give voice to that, right? Talk to those, and and it's not necessarily talk to your policymakers or talk to your government officials. No, talk to everyone, right?
Yeah.
Begin to send out a clarion call on what you're seeing. Like the numbers for the trauma units in this greater Sacramento area when it comes to trauma are outrageous, right? And you're seeing all these traumas, these young traumas coming in. These aren't things to keep to ourselves and say, oh man, that's terrible what's happening. Oh, it's another tough day at work. No, we need to really start saying, well, who's doing something about this?
Right.
And if not who, then what are we doing? Are we going out? Are we saying anything like, hey, there's a lot of stuff happening and I don't think it's right or whatnot? Just being the voice for those who are voiceless, because working in the community, living in the community, that's one of the things that I know is super difficult for the community to articulate where I hurt, what I need, and it's evident through the data that we get. We get all the data, it's right there. And it's evident in the population we're seeing coming in. Start to speak on those things, be a voice.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So some takeaways for people watching this clip is to maintain that human connection with people they're working with and to have a voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with me today and having this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
It's been
you.
wonderful.
All
Yeah.
right.